The quiet cornerstone. The early morning sun filtered through the slatted blinds of Thomas Johnson's modest home. Its warm glow bathed the room in soft amber hues, illuminating the neatly arranged bookshelves and the worn yet sturdy armchair that had long served as his favorite spot for quiet reflection. This was where Thomas often began his days, surrounded by the echoes of history and the whispers of memories that had shaped him. At 72, Thomas carried himself with a quiet dignity that commanded respect without ever demanding it. His presence was like the steady rhythm of a heartbeat, reliable, grounding, and comforting to those who knew him. A retired Army veteran, Thomas had spent his life serving not only his country, but also his community. For years, he had been a mentor, a teacher, and a steadfast advocate for unity and understanding in his tight-knit neighborhood. Yet, despite the admiration he received, he remained deeply humble, more comfortable listening than speaking, and more inclined to action than to words. This morning, like many others, began with Thomas lacing up his weathered walking shoes and stepping out onto the quiet streets of his neighborhood. The air was crisp, carrying the faint aroma of freshly brewed coffee from a nearby cafe. He greeted the familiar faces he passed with a warm smile and a nod, his quiet presence a reassuring constant in a world that often felt chaotic. As he strolled, Thomas's mind wandered to the evening ahead. The community center, a cherished hub of activity and connection, was hosting an event honoring veterans like him. It was a gathering he had helped organize, a space for shared stories, mutual respect, and the kind of camaraderie that transcended generations. For Thomas, the center was more than just a building. It was a symbol of resilience and unity, a place where the scars of the past could be met with understanding and hope. By late afternoon, the community center was abuzz with activity. Volunteers bustled about, arranging chairs, setting up refreshments, and ensuring everything was just right for the evening's event. Thomas arrived early, as he often did, eager to lend a hand. His gentle demeanor and unassuming nature made him a natural leader, someone people gravitated toward in times of need. "Mr. J, can you believe we pulled this off?" Marcus, a young man in his 20s and a regular volunteer, grinned as he approached Thomas. Marcus had always looked up to him, seeing in the older man a quiet strength he hoped to emulate. Thomas chuckled softly, his weathered hand steady as he unfolded a chair. "You all did a fine job, Marcus. I'm just here to make sure I don't get in the way." Marcus laughed, shaking his head. "Come on, Mr. J, you're the heart of this place. We wouldn't be here without you." Thomas smiled but said nothing, his modesty refusing to let him take credit for the sense of community that had flourished around him. As the evening drew closer, people began to trickle in, young and old, veterans and civilians, all drawn together by a shared sense of respect and gratitude. The event was in full swing when Officer Derek Wallace entered the room. Tall and broad-shouldered, with an air of authority that seemed more practiced than genuine, Derek's arrival was impossible to ignore. His sharp gaze swept across the room, taking in the warmth and unity with a flicker of disdain. To Derek, gatherings like these were unnecessary distractions, sentimental displays that held no real value in a world that, to him, was defined by power and control. Thomas, engrossed in a conversation with a fellow veteran, didn't notice Derek's arrival until the officer's voice cut through the hum of conversation like a blade. "Hey, old man," Derek called out, his tone sharp and mocking. "Shouldn't you be somewhere else?" The room fell silent, the weight of Derek's words pressing down like a heavy stone. All eyes turned toward Thomas, who stood motionless in the center of the room. For a moment, the air was thick with stunned disbelief, the warmth of the evening suddenly replaced by a palpable tension. Thomas turned slowly to face Derek, his expression calm but his eyes betraying a flicker of pain. It wasn't the first time he had encountered this kind of disrespect, but it was rare, so rare that it caught him off guard. This was his community, his sanctuary, a place where he had always felt valued and respected. To be treated as though he didn't belong here was a sting he hadn't anticipated. "I have every right to be here," Thomas said softly, his voice steady despite the sting of the officer's words. Derek's laugh was sharp and bitter, a sound that seemed to echo off the walls. "Right," he sneered. "People like you think they have rights here. This isn't a place for you." The crowd, initially frozen in shock, began to stir. Some looked away, unable to meet Thomas's gaze, while others watched intently, their faces etched with a mixture of anger and anticipation. Marcus, standing a few feet away, clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as he fought the urge to step in. But Thomas raised a hand, a subtle gesture that spoke volumes. He didn't need anyone to fight this battle for him. This was a moment he had to face on his own. "I've earned my place here," Thomas said, his voice quiet but unyielding. "Through years of service, through sacrifice, through actions that speak louder than words." Derek's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered, stepping closer to Thomas. The shine of his badge caught the light, a stark contrast to the darkness in his eyes. "You think that means anything to me?" Derek hissed. "You're just an old man clinging to a past that no one cares about anymore." And then, without warning, Derek shoved Thomas. The room gasped collectively as Thomas staggered back, his hand gripping the edge of a chair for support. Despite the force of the shove, he didn't fall. He straightened slowly, his gaze locking onto Derek's with a quiet, unshakable strength. Around them, the room was charged with emotion. Some were frozen in place, their faces pale with shock, while others exchanged murmurs of disbelief and outrage. Marcus took a step forward, his anger bubbling to the surface, but Thomas stopped him with a glance. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, but Thomas knew that this battle, like so many he had faced before, required more than anger. It required strength, dignity, and an unwavering commitment to what was right. And he would not back down. The echoes of silence, the silence that followed Derek's shove, was deafening. The crowd, frozen in a mix of shock and anger, barely breathed. Thomas stood still, his hand gripping the back of the chair for balance, his eyes locked on Derek's with an intensity that betrayed his calm demeanor. His heart pounded, not with fear, but with a deep, simmering resolve. He had faced worse, far worse, on battlefields far from home. But this was his community, his sanctuary, and the violation stung in a way he hadn't anticipated. Derek's chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, his smirk twisting into something darker. The room, filled with the faces of neighbors, friends, and strangers who respected Thomas, became a theater for Derek's misplaced dominance. He was used to his badge shielding him from consequences, his authority keeping people in line. Yet, standing before Thomas, he found no fear in the man's eyes, only quiet defiance. "You don't get it, do you?" Derek sneered, stepping closer. "I'm the law here. People like you, relics of a past nobody cares about anymore. You think your sacrifices mean something to me." Thomas straightened, letting go of the chair. He adjusted his jacket, his movements deliberate, as if to remind himself to stay grounded. The tension in the room was suffocating, but he refused to let it pull him down. "My sacrifices weren't for you," Thomas said, his voice calm but cutting. "They were for the people in this room, for the lives we've built, the community we've nurtured. You don't get to define what I've earned." Derek's face twitched, his fists clenching at his sides. The crowd began to stir, whispers rippling through the room like a growing tide. Marcus, standing a few steps behind Thomas, felt his anger boiling over. He had seen Thomas as a mentor, a guide, and a symbol of resilience, and to witness this blatant disrespect filled him with rage. "Back off," Marcus said, stepping forward. His voice was low, but it carried the weight of his anger. "You don't talk to him like that." Derek turned his gaze to Marcus, his smirk returning as if he relished the challenge. "Or what?" he taunted, his voice dripping with arrogance. "You going to teach me a lesson, kid?" Marcus opened his mouth to reply, but Thomas raised his hand again, signaling for silence. Marcus hesitated, his jaw tightening as he reluctantly stepped back. Thomas turned his attention to the crowd, scanning their faces. He saw anger, fear, and confusion, but also something else: shame. Shame that they had let this happen, that they had stood by and watched as a man they respected was humiliated. "This isn't just about me," Thomas said, his voice carrying across the room. "This is about all of us. Every single one of us who's ever been told we don't belong, that we're not enough. It's about what we're willing to stand for." The crowd began to shift, people straightening their backs and lifting their heads. Derek's smirk faltered as he realized the energy in the room was changing. What he thought would be an easy display of power was slipping through his fingers. "You think they're going to stand by you?" Derek scoffed, gesturing toward the crowd. "People like this, they're cowards. They'll fold the second things get hard." "No," a voice called out from the back of the room. Everyone turned to see Linda, a retired schoolteacher who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, stepping forward. Her voice trembled with emotion, but her eyes were fierce. "We're not cowards. We've just been quiet for too long." Her words seemed to ignite a spark in the room. Others began to step forward, their voices joining hers. "We're with you, Mr. Johnson," another man said, his voice resolute. "This isn't right. You don't get to treat him like that," a woman added, her hands clenched at her sides. Derek's eyes darted around the room, his confidence faltering as the crowd's energy shifted against him. Thomas remained calm, letting the voices of his community rise around him like a shield. He had no need to yell or fight. His strength came from the people standing with him. "Enough of this," Derek barked, trying to regain control. His voice cracked slightly, betraying his frustration. "This isn't a debate. This is my jurisdiction, and you're all pushing your luck." Thomas stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate, until he was standing directly in front of Derek. The younger man's bravado seemed to shrink in the presence of the quiet intensity radiating from Thomas. "You've misunderstood something, officer," Thomas said, his voice low but firm. "Authority doesn't come from a badge. It comes from the people you serve. And right now, I don't see anyone here standing with you." The weight of Thomas's words landed like a blow, and for a moment, Derek said nothing. The silence in the room was heavy, but it carried a different energy now, one of unity and defiance. Derek finally stepped back, his face twisted in a mixture of anger and humiliation. Without another word, he turned and stormed out of the room, the echo of his footsteps fading into the night. The tension in the room broke like a dam, replaced by a swell of relief and quiet pride. Marcus turned to Thomas, his eyes wide with admiration. "You didn't even have to raise your voice," he said, shaking his head. "How do you do it?" Thomas smiled faintly, the lines around his eyes softening. "It's not about how loud you speak, Marcus. It's about the strength behind your words." The crowd began to disperse, but the weight of what had happened lingered. Thomas knew this wasn't over. Derek's pride had been wounded, and men like him didn't let that go easily. But Thomas also knew that tonight had been a turning point. The community had found its voice, and with it, a strength they hadn't realized they possessed. As Thomas walked home, under the soft glow of the streetlights, he felt a deep sense of purpose settling in his chest. This was just the beginning. The fight for respect, for dignity, for justice, it wasn't over. But he wasn't alone. Together, they would face whatever came next, one step at a time. Fractured foundations. The community center had become a quiet refuge by the time Thomas made his way back there the following evening. The air carried the lingering scent of fresh coffee, mingled with the faint musk of old books and polished wood. It was a place steeped in history and shared memories, its walls bearing witness to countless moments of joy, struggle, and quiet triumphs. Thomas entered the center with his usual calm demeanor, nodding at Marcus, who was arranging chairs for the nightly gathering. Marcus had insisted on arriving early, his youthful energy a stark contrast to the weariness etched into Thomas's face. The events of the previous night had left an undeniable mark, not only on Thomas but on the entire neighborhood. The confrontation with Derek Wallace wasn't just a singular event. It had torn open an unspoken wound in the community, a festering tension between those who sought to live with dignity and those who wielded power like a weapon. "Mr. J," Marcus called out, his voice tinged with both respect and concern. "You think Derek's coming back?" Thomas paused, his hands resting on the back of a chair. He exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on the polished floor as if searching for an answer in its reflection. "Men like Derek," he said finally, his voice steady but heavy with meaning, "don't walk away without trying to prove a point. But this isn't just about him. It's about what we do now, how we hold our ground." Marcus nodded, but his brow furrowed. "It's just, people are scared. Mr. J last night, he tried to intimidate you in front of everyone. What's to stop him from doing worse?" Thomas straightened, his shoulders squaring as if under the weight of an invisible burden. He placed a firm hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Fear's a powerful thing, son," he said quietly, "but it only wins if we let it. Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about standing up in spite of it." As the evening wore on, the community center began to fill with familiar faces. Linda, the retired teacher who had spoken up the night before, arrived with a determined look in her eye. George, the local handyman who had grown up in the neighborhood, brought his teenage son, a quiet boy with wide, curious eyes. Others trickled in, their expressions a mix of apprehension and quiet resolve. Thomas stood at the front of the room, his presence steadying the murmurs of the growing crowd. When the room fell silent, he began to speak, his voice calm but carrying the weight of years of experience. "We all know what happened last night," he said, his gaze sweeping over the room. "But this isn't the first time someone's tried to silence us, and it won't be the last. What matters is how we respond. Do we let fear dictate our lives? Or do we stand together, stronger because we refuse to be divided?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Linda rose from her seat. "We can't let Derek keep doing this," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "He's been using his badge to bully us for too long. It's time we did something about it." George nodded, his rough hands resting on the shoulders of his son. "But what can we do, Thomas? He's the law in this town. How do we fight back without making things worse?" Thomas took a moment to collect his thoughts, his gaze steady and unwavering. "We start by holding him accountable," he said. "We document everything, every interaction, every threat, every act of intimidation. And we don't do it alone. We do it together, as a community." The plan began to take shape as the room buzzed with determination. People volunteered to keep logs of their encounters with Derek, to record their stories, and to share them with the local council. A young woman named Carla, who worked as a journalist for a small local paper, offered to compile the accounts into a comprehensive report. "I'll make sure this gets seen," Carla said, her voice filled with quiet conviction. "If we can show a pattern, we can demand action." The atmosphere in the room shifted from fear to resolve, the collective energy building into something tangible. For the first time in a long while, the community felt united, their voices blending into a harmonious force that could no longer be ignored. As the meeting wound down, Thomas lingered, watching as people exchanged ideas and encouragement. Marcus approached him, his youthful enthusiasm tempered by the weight of the moment. "Mr. J," Marcus said, his voice low, "I'm with you. Whatever happens, I've got your back." Thomas placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, his expression softening. "I know you do, son. And that means more than you know." The ripples of resistance. The following days were tense, the air in the neighborhood charged with an almost electric anticipation. Derek's patrol car became a constant presence, its ominous silhouette a reminder of the power he wielded. He made his rounds more frequently, his eyes scanning the streets with a predatory intensity that set everyone on edge. People whispered about late-night stops and tickets issued for the most minor of infractions. Derek wasn't subtle. His actions were a clear message, a warning that he was still in control. But the community, emboldened by Thomas's leadership, refused to be silenced. They kept their logs, shared their stories, and leaned on one another for strength. One evening, as Thomas sat on his front porch, Marcus arrived with a small group of young men and women from the neighborhood. They carried notebooks, phones, and cameras, their expressions a mix of determination and nervous energy. "We've been keeping track," Marcus said, handing Thomas a notebook filled with detailed accounts of Derek's actions. "Every time he stops someone, every ticket he writes. We're not letting him get away with this." Thomas flipped through the pages, his chest tightening as he read the entries. Each one was a testament to the quiet bravery of his neighbors, a reminder that their collective strength was growing. "You've done good work," Thomas said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This is how we fight back, not with violence, but with truth." The gathering storm. One night, the tension finally boiled over. Thomas was walking home from the community center when he saw Derek's patrol car parked at the corner of his street. Derek leaned against the hood, his posture casual but his eyes cold and calculating. "Mr. Johnson," Derek called out, his voice smooth and mocking. "Out for another stroll? You sure you should be out this late?" Thomas stopped, his heart steady as he met Derek's gaze. "This is my neighborhood, officer," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I don't need your permission to walk these streets." Derek pushed off the car and stepped closer, his smirk twisting into something more sinister. "You think you're untouchable, don't you? Just because you've got a few people rallying behind you. But let me tell you something, old man. You're not as strong as you think." Thomas stood his ground, his posture straight and unyielding. "Strength doesn't come from fear, Derek. It comes from standing up for what's right. And this community is stronger than you realize." Derek's smirk faltered, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face, before he masked it with a sneer. "We'll see about that," he said, stepping back toward his car. "You might want to watch yourself, Johnson. You never know when your luck might run out." As Derek drove off, Thomas stood in the quiet street, the weight of the encounter settling over him. He knew the battle was far from over, but he also knew he wasn't alone. The community had found its voice, and together, they were unstoppable. Whatever came next, they would face it as one. The spark of defiance. The days following Derek's ominous warning were a haze of tension and quiet determination. The neighborhood seemed caught in a perpetual state of unease, as if holding its collective breath. Derek's patrol car was an almost permanent fixture now, parked at random corners, its presence an unspoken reminder of his lingering authority. But for every hour he spent posturing in his cruiser, the community spent organizing, documenting, and quietly resisting. Thomas had become a symbol of strength for the neighborhood, though he often shrugged off the label when people tried to pin it on him. To him, his role wasn't about heroism. It was about necessity. Someone had to stand up and remind the community of its worth, and if that someone had to be him, so be it. But as the days passed, the burden of leadership weighed heavily on his shoulders. Every whispered fear, every quiet confession from his neighbors about Derek's escalating intimidation, added to the load. One afternoon, Thomas sat in the small sunlit office of Carla, the journalist who had taken up their cause. Her desk was cluttered with papers, notebooks, and a laptop that hummed faintly as she typed. Carla had been relentless in gathering the stories from the neighborhood, compiling them into a detailed expose about Derek's abuse of power. "This isn't just about Derek," Carla said, her fingers pausing over the keyboard as she looked up at Thomas. "It's about a system that allows men like him to thrive. If we can get this published, it could shine a light on something much bigger." Thomas nodded, his hands folded in his lap. "I don't care about making headlines," he said. "I care about making this a place where people don't have to look over their shoulders. If this can do that, then I'm with you." Carla offered him a small, resolute smile before returning to her work. "I'll make sure it's seen, but you need to be ready for the blowback. People like Derek don't go quietly." Thomas didn't respond immediately, his gaze drifting to the window where sunlight filtered through the blinds. He thought of the faces of his neighbors, their fear, their hope, and he made a silent promise to them. No matter what came next, he wouldn't let them down. The tipping point. The neighborhood's quiet resistance reached its boiling point one crisp November evening. The air was cold, tinged with the earthy scent of fallen leaves, and the sky above was a dark canvas dotted with stars. A meeting had been called at the community center, a gathering to discuss the next steps in their fight against Derek's intimidation. Word had spread quickly, and by the time Thomas arrived, the room was packed. People stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces a mix of anger, hope, and exhaustion. Some clutched notebooks filled with documentation, while others carried cameras or phones, ready to record anything that might unfold. The energy in the room crackled like a live wire, charged with a collective resolve that had been building for weeks. Thomas made his way to the front of the room, his presence quieting the murmurs of the crowd. He stood tall, his hands resting on the back of a chair as he scanned the room. He saw Linda and George near the front, their expressions resolute. Marcus stood off to the side, his youthful determination etched into every line of his face. Carla was in the back, her notebook open and pen poised. "I won't lie to you," Thomas began, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't going to be easy. Derek's not just going to back down because we've stood up to him. He's going to push back, harder than ever. But that's why we have to keep pushing together." A ripple of agreement ran through the crowd, but there was an underlying tension in the room, a shared fear of what might come next. Thomas felt it, the weight of their collective anxiety, but he refused to let it shake him. "Every story you've shared, every note you've taken, every step you've made toward standing up for yourselves, it matters," Thomas continued. "It's proof that we're stronger than fear, stronger than intimidation, and if we stay united, we can't be broken." The crowd erupted into applause, their voices filling the room with a fierce energy. For a moment, it felt as if the walls themselves were vibrating with their resolve. But the moment was shattered when the door to the community center slammed open. The confrontation. Derek Wallace stood in the doorway, his broad frame silhouetted against the streetlights outside. The room fell into an uneasy silence, the tension so thick it felt as if the air had been sucked out. Derek's gaze swept over the crowd, his lips curling into a smirk that sent a chill through the room. "Well, isn't this cozy?" he drawled, stepping inside. "A little gathering of troublemakers, huh? What's the agenda tonight? Plotting how to make my life harder?" Thomas stepped forward, placing himself between Derek and the crowd. His movements were deliberate, his posture calm but firm. "This is a community meeting," he said, his voice steady. "And you're not welcome here, Officer Wallace." Derek's smirk widened, but there was a flicker of something darker in his eyes. "Not welcome. I'm the law in this town, old man. I go where I please." "You're not here to serve the law," Thomas replied, his voice rising slightly but still measured. "You're here to intimidate, to silence. But it won't work. Not anymore." The crowd murmured in agreement, their voices low but growing in strength. Derek's smirk faltered, replaced by a sneer. He stepped closer to Thomas, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You think you're untouchable, don't you?" he hissed. "Think these people will keep standing with you when things get real?" Thomas didn't flinch. He met Derek's gaze head-on, his expression calm but unwavering. "It's not about me," he said. "It's about us. And we're not afraid of you anymore." Derek's fists clenched at his sides, his jaw tightening as he fought to keep his composure. The room was charged with an almost unbearable tension, the crowd watching with bated breath. "Get out." Linda's voice rang out from the crowd, clear and resolute. "You don't belong here." Others joined her, their voices rising in a chorus of defiance. "Get out," they shouted. "You're not welcome here." Derek's face twisted with fury, but he didn't move. The crowd, emboldened by their collective strength, began to step forward, their voices growing louder. "Leave," Derek, Marcus shouted, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. You don't scare us anymore. Faced with the united front of the community, Derek finally took a step back. His gaze flicked between Thomas and the crowd, his expression a mix of anger and disbelief. Without another word, he turned and stormed out, the doors slamming shut behind him. The dawn of change. As the room settled into a stunned silence, Thomas turned to face the crowd. Their faces were flushed with a mixture of relief and pride, their voices buzzing with the realization that they had stood up to Derek and won. This is just the beginning, Thomas said, his voice steady but filled with quiet determination. He'll come back, but we'll be ready. We'll keep standing together. Because that's how we win, not through fear, but through unity. The crowd erupted into applause once more, their cheers echoing through the room. For the first time in weeks, hope felt tangible, a light breaking through the storm clouds that had hung over the neighborhood for so long. As Thomas stepped down, Marcus approached him, his eyes shining with admiration. We did it, Mr. G, he said, his voice filled with awe. We actually did it. Thomas placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, his expression softening. We're just getting started, he said, but we'll see this through, together. And as the night wore on, the community's resolve only grew stronger. They had faced the storm and come out standing. Whatever lay ahead, they knew they wouldn't face it alone. The cracks in the armor. The confrontation at the community center left a mark on the neighborhood, a mix of triumph and unease that lingered in the air like the fading echo of a distant storm. The crowd had cheered as Derek Wallace stormed out, his authority momentarily diminished by the collective strength of those he sought to control. But victory, Thomas knew, was a fleeting thing. Derek's pride had been wounded, and men like him didn't lick their wounds quietly. They retaliated. Thomas woke the next morning to find a small crowd gathered on the sidewalk outside his home. Marcus stood among them, his face a mixture of anger and worry. What's going on? Thomas asked, stepping onto the porch. His eyes scanned the scene until they landed on his mailbox, its metal frame twisted and mangled, the post splintered where it had been forcibly removed from the ground. The wreckage lay strewn across his front yard, a silent warning. It happened last night, Marcus said, his voice low. After the meeting, I was walking home when I saw his car drive by. I should have. This isn't on you, son, Thomas interrupted, his tone firm but kind. This is what people do when they feel their power slipping. They lash out. Mr. J, Linda said, stepping forward, her face pale with concern. You should report this. He can't get away with it. Thomas nodded, but his expression remained calm. We will, he said, but not just this, all of it. The neighborhood had been keeping meticulous records of Derek's actions, every ticket issued without cause, every late-night patrol that ended in harassment, every cold, condescending word spoken to those who dared question him. Carla had been compiling the stories, turning them into a growing exposé that would soon be ready for publication. But as the neighborhood rallied behind Thomas, Derek escalated. His patrol car became a weapon, prowling the streets at all hours, his presence an unspoken threat. He stopped teenagers walking home from school, demanded IDs from parents picking up their children, and loomed outside the community center during evening meetings. Fear crept into the cracks of the neighborhood's resolve, whispering doubts into the hearts of even the bravest. A fractured shield. One cold evening, Thomas stood in the community center's small kitchen, pouring coffee into paper cups for the latest gathering. The room beyond was filled with familiar faces, though some were missing. Fear, it seemed, had already claimed a few of their own. As Thomas carried the tray into the main hall, Marcus intercepted him. Mr. G, Marcus said, his voice urgent. We've got a problem. Thomas set the tray down on a nearby table. What is it? Marcus hesitated, his jaw tightening as he glanced toward the door. George, he's been saying we should back off, that we're pushing too hard. He's worried about his son. Thomas nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. Where is he? Marcus motioned toward the back corner of the room, where George sat with his teenage son. The boy's face was pale, his eyes downcast, and George's hand rested protectively on his shoulder. Thomas approached them quietly, his presence drawing George's gaze upward. "George," Thomas said, his tone warm but firm. "Can we talk?" George sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Thomas, I don't know if we can keep doing this. My boy, he's scared. Derek stopped him yesterday, made him empty his backpack right there on the sidewalk. Said he was just doing his job, but we both know what that was." Thomas pulled up a chair, his eyes softening as he looked at George and his son. "I understand your fear," he said. "It's real, and it's valid. But giving in to it won't make it go away. It'll only give Derek more power. He wants us divided, scared, questioning each other. That's how he wins." George looked down, his hand tightening on his son's shoulder. "I just don't want to lose him, Thomas. He's my world. And I'd never ask you to put him in harm's way," Thomas said gently. "But standing together isn't just about us. It's about what we leave behind for them. For the next generation, if we don't fight now, they'll face the same battles we're fighting. And they'll wonder why we didn't do more." George's son lifted his eyes, meeting Thomas's gaze. There was something there. Fear, yes, but also a spark of something stronger. Hope. "Do you think we can win?" the boy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Thomas smiled faintly. "I don't know about winning," he said, "but I know we can change things. And that's worth fighting for." George sighed again, but this time there was a note of resignation in it, a quiet acceptance of the truth in Thomas's words. He nodded slowly, his grip on his son's shoulder relaxing. "We're with you, Thomas. Just tell us what to do." A gathering storm. As the weeks went on, the neighborhood's efforts to document Derek's actions reached a fever pitch. Carla's article was nearly complete, her desk covered in notes, photographs, and first-hand accounts. The final piece was a public meeting with the city council, where the community would present their case and demand action. The night before the meeting, Thomas sat alone in his small living room, a steaming cup of tea on the table beside him. The house was quiet, save for the faint creak of the floorboards beneath his chair. He stared at the photograph on the wall, a black and white image of his younger self in uniform, standing beside his late wife. Her smile, radiant and full of life, seemed to reach across time to steady him. "I hope I'm doing this right, Sarah," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I hope I'm making you proud." The knock at the door startled him from his thoughts. Rising slowly, Thomas opened the door to find Marcus standing there, his breath visible in the cold night air. "Mr. G," Marcus said, his voice trembling slightly. "We've got a problem. Derek. He's parked outside Carla's house." Thomas's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. "How long has he been there?" "An hour, maybe more," Marcus said. "She called me. She's scared, Mr. J." Thomas grabbed his coat, his resolve hardening like steel. "Let's go." A line in the sand. When they arrived at Carla's house, Derek's patrol car was parked across the street, its headlights off but its presence unmistakable. Carla stood in the doorway, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Thomas approached her, his voice low and reassuring. "It's okay, Carla," he said. "We're here." Derek stepped out of his car then, his movements deliberate, his smirk illuminated by the faint glow of a nearby street lamp. "Evening, Johnson," he said, his tone mocking. "Out for a little stroll." Thomas stepped forward, placing himself between Derek and Carla's house. "What are you doing here, Derek?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "Just keeping an eye on things," Derek replied, his smirk widening. "Can't have the press stirring up trouble, now can we?" "This isn't keeping the peace," Thomas said, his gaze steady. "This is harassment. And it stops now." Derek's smirk faltered, his fists clenching at his sides. "Careful, "Old man," he said, his voice low and venomous, "you don't want to push me." Thomas didn't flinch. He stood tall, his posture unwavering, and behind him, Marcus and Carla stepped forward, their presence a silent show of solidarity. "You're done, Derek," Thomas said, his voice filled with quiet authority. "The community sees you for what you are. And tomorrow, so will the council." Derek's face twisted with rage, but he didn't respond. Instead, he climbed back into his car and drove off, the sound of his engine fading into the night. As the group stood there in the cold, a new sense of resolve settled over them. The battle wasn't over, but the lines had been drawn, and for the first time, they felt ready to face whatever came next, together. The reckoning. The city council chamber was packed to capacity, its walls straining to contain the tension that hung in the air. Every seat was filled, and people spilled into the aisles, their murmured conversations a low hum of anticipation. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a stark, clinical glow, but the warmth of the community's presence was undeniable. For many, this wasn't just a meeting. It was a moment of truth. Thomas sat near the front of the room, his hands resting calmly on his knees. He was flanked by Marcus on one side and Carla on the other, their faces a mixture of determination and quiet nerves. Behind them sat rows of familiar faces: Linda, George, and countless others who had come to stand together. Their solidarity was unspoken but palpable. At the front of the chamber sat the city council members, their expressions ranging from attentive to mildly disinterested. In the corner of the room, Derek Wallace leaned against a wall, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His face was a mask of smug defiance, but his eyes betrayed the storm brewing beneath. He scanned the room with thinly veiled contempt, his jaw tightening every time his gaze landed on Thomas. As the meeting began, the council chair, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and an air of authority, called the room to order. After the usual formalities, she gestured to the microphone at the podium. "Mr. Johnson," she said, her tone neutral, "you've requested to address the council. The floor is yours." Thomas rose slowly, his movements deliberate, and made his way to the podium. The room fell silent, every eye trained on him. He placed his hands on the wooden surface of the lectern, his gaze steady as he looked out over the sea of faces. "Thank you, Madam Chair," Thomas began, his voice calm but carrying the weight of conviction. "I stand here today not as a man seeking attention, but as a representative of a community that has been silenced for too long." He paused, letting his words settle, before continuing. "For weeks, months, even, we have endured intimidation, harassment, and a blatant abuse of power from someone who was sworn to protect us. Officer Derek Wallace has used his badge not as a symbol of service, but as a weapon to instill fear." A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Thomas pressed on. "But this is not just about one man. It's about the system that allows men like him to thrive. It's about a culture that values control over compassion, power over principle." Thomas stepped back for a moment, allowing Carla to approach the podium. She carried a thick folder, its edges frayed from weeks of handling. Carla adjusted the microphone and spoke with a clarity that belied her nerves. "This," she said, holding up the folder, "is a comprehensive record of Officer Wallace's behavior over the past year. It includes first-hand accounts from over 50 residents, documenting everything from unwarranted traffic stops to verbal threats and targeted harassment." She opened the folder and began reading excerpts. Her voice was steady, but the accounts were damning. March 12th, Carla read. Officer Wallace stopped a group of teenagers walking home from school. He demanded their IDs and accused them of loitering, despite their being in a public park during daylight hours. May 4th, she continued. He issued a parking citation to a disabled veteran who had parked legally but whose placard was partially obscured by sunlight. July 22nd, she said, her voice rising slightly. He followed a single mother home, citing a broken tail light, and berated her in front of her children for 20 minutes. Witnesses report no taillight malfunction. Each account landed like a blow, the weight of the evidence building as Carla continued. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, a mixture of anger and disbelief. Thomas watched the faces of the council members, their initial disinterest giving way to unease. The breaking point. When Carla finished, she stepped back, her hands trembling slightly as she handed the folder to the council chair. The room was buzzing now, the air charged with the collective energy of the community. But Derek, standing in his corner, refused to back down. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. He stepped forward, his expression a mask of controlled fury. "These so-called accounts are nothing but hearsay. You're all just looking for someone to blame, and you've picked me because I'm the only one doing my job." The room erupted into chaos, shouts of anger and disbelief, voices rising to challenge Derek's claim. The council chair banged her gavel, her voice straining to restore order. "Enough," she said sharply. "Officer Wallace, you'll have your chance to respond. For now, please remain seated." Derek glared at her but stepped back, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His gaze flicked to Thomas, his eyes narrowing with barely concealed rage. The chair turned her attention back to Thomas. "Mr. Johnson," she said, her tone softening slightly, "is there anything else you wish to add?" Thomas nodded, his expression calm but resolute. "I'd like to say this," he said. "Respect is not something that can be demanded. It's earned through service, through humility, through integrity. This community has given so much, its trust, its faith, and it has been repaid with fear and intimidation. That ends today." The turning tide. For the first time in weeks, Thomas saw something shift in the room. The council members exchanged glances, their discomfort growing. The weight of the evidence, combined with the voices of the community, was undeniable. The chair turned to Derek. "Officer Wallace," she said, her voice firm, "the council will conduct a full investigation into these allegations. Effective immediately, you are placed on administrative leave pending the outcome." The room erupted into cheers, the collective relief palpable. Derek's face turned a deep shade of red, his fists clenching at his sides. He opened his mouth to protest, but the chair silenced him with a sharp look. "This matter is no longer up for debate," she said. "The council has spoken." The aftermath. As the meeting adjourned, the crowd spilled into the streets, their voices rising in celebration. For the first time in months, the neighborhood felt a sense of victory, a light breaking through the storm. Thomas stood at the edge of the crowd, his shoulders heavy but his heart light. "You did it, Mr. J," Marcus said, his grin wide. "We all did it." Thomas nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "This isn't just about one man," he said. "It's about all of us, about what we're willing to fight for." In the days that followed, Derek's name became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the power of a united community. The council's investigation led to his dismissal, and reforms were introduced to ensure greater accountability within the police force. But for Thomas, the victory was more personal. As he walked through the neighborhood, he saw it in the faces of his neighbors, the hope, the pride, the newfound sense of strength. They had faced the storm and come out stronger, united by a bond that no amount of intimidation could break. And as he sat on his porch one quiet evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Thomas allowed himself a moment of peace. The fight wasn't over. There were always new battles to face, new injustices to confront. But for now, he was content, knowing that together, they had changed their world for the better. And that, he thought, was a legacy worth leaving. A new dawn. The days following Officer Derek Wallace's dismissal were a time of both healing and reflection for the neighborhood. The streets, once cloaked in an oppressive silence, broken only by the low rumble of Derek's patrol car, now hummed with a renewed sense of life. Children played on the sidewalks without fear, neighbors lingered on their porches to chat, and the community center was busier than ever, a hive of activity and connection. Yet beneath the surface, the scars of the battle lingered. For Thomas Johnson, the sense of victory was tempered by the knowledge that the work was far from over. The removal of Derek was a crucial step, but it was just the beginning of a larger fight to ensure that such abuses of power would never happen again. The system that had allowed Derek to thrive still loomed large, and Thomas knew they had to address the root causes of the injustice they had faced. Seeds of change. It was a brisk Saturday morning when Thomas found himself once again at the community center, the sun casting long shadows across the worn steps. Inside, the room buzzed with activity as volunteers gathered to discuss the next phase of their efforts. Carla had taken the lead in coordinating the neighborhood's newfound momentum, her journalist instincts now focused on activism. "We've got the council's attention," Carla said, addressing the group from the front of the room. "But we can't let this stop here. We need to push for systemic change. Policies that hold officers accountable, that ensure transparency and fairness." Marcus nodded from his seat near the front, his notebook open on his lap. "What about the review board idea?" he asked. "A group of community members who oversee complaints against the police." Carla nodded. "Exactly. Civilian oversight is one of the best ways to make sure the community's voice is heard. But we'll need to gather support, not just here, but across the city." The room murmured in agreement, the energy palpable. Thomas sat quietly, listening to the younger voices take the lead. He was proud of them, proud of the way they had risen to the occasion, finding their strength in the face of adversity. When the discussion turned to outreach strategies, Thomas finally spoke. "Change takes time," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "But it starts with small steps. Conversations, building trust. If we want this to last, we need to focus on bringing people together, not just pointing fingers." The room fell silent for a moment as everyone absorbed his words. Then Carla smiled. "You're right, Thomas. We need to approach this with both urgency and patience. It's about creating something sustainable, bridging divides." As the weeks passed, the neighborhood's efforts began to expand. They hosted town halls, inviting residents from across the city to share their experiences and ideas. The meetings were often emotional. Stories of discrimination and abuse surfaced, interwoven with moments of resilience and hope. Thomas attended every one, his quiet presence a source of comfort and inspiration for those who spoke. One evening, as Thomas was leaving a particularly heated meeting, he was approached by a young officer named Elena Martinez. She was new to the force, her uniform still crisp and her expression conflicted. "Mr. Johnson," she began hesitantly, her hands clasped in front of her. "Can I talk to you for a moment?" Thomas nodded, stepping aside to give her space. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Elena hesitated, her eyes darting to the ground before meeting his gaze. "I've heard the stories about Officer Wallace," she said, "and I know that things like that happen. But not all of us are like him. Some of us join because we want to make a difference, to help people." Thomas studied her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "I believe you," he said finally. "But belief isn't enough. It's about actions, about proving that you're willing to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard." Elena nodded slowly. "I want to help," she said. "Tell me how I can." A united front. With Elena's involvement, the neighborhood's efforts gained a new layer of credibility. She became a bridge between the community and the police force, advocating for change from within. Together, they worked to draft a proposal for a civilian oversight board, presenting it to the city council alongside testimonies from residents and officers alike. The council meeting where the proposal was debated drew an even larger crowd than the one that had sealed Derek's fate. The chamber was filled with a mix of hope and skepticism, the air crackling with anticipation. Carla and Marcus presented the proposal, their voices steady but impassioned. "This isn't about punishing officers," Carla said. "It's about creating a system where accountability and trust go hand in hand, where the community and the police work together, not against each other." Elena followed, her uniform a stark contrast to the casual attire of the other speakers. "I became an officer because I wanted to serve," she said. "But service means listening. It means admitting when we get things wrong and working to make them right. This oversight board is a step in the right direction." The council deliberated for hours, but when the vote was finally called, the proposal passed by a narrow margin. The chamber erupted into applause, the sound a cathartic release of weeks of effort and anticipation. The legacy. In the weeks that followed, the Oversight Board was established, its members carefully chosen to reflect the diversity of the city. The neighborhood's victory became a beacon of hope for other communities, sparking similar efforts across the region. Thomas watched it all unfold with a quiet pride. He had never sought recognition or accolades, but the knowledge that his community had come together to create lasting change was more than enough. He continued to mentor the younger generation, his wisdom and experience a steady guide, as they navigated the challenges ahead. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset, Marcus joined him, a notebook tucked under his arm. The young man sat down beside him, his expression thoughtful. "Mr. G," Marcus said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Do you ever feel like it's not enough? Like there's always more to do?" Thomas smiled faintly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "There's always more to do," he said. "But that's not a bad thing. It means we're still moving forward, still trying. And as long as we're trying, we're making a difference." Marcus nodded, his expression softening. "I'm glad you're here," he said. "I don't think any of this would have happened without you." Thomas placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, his grip firm but gentle. "It wasn't me," he said. "It was all of us. And it always will be." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in shades of gold and amber, Thomas felt a profound sense of peace. The battle they had fought was just one chapter in a larger story, a story of resilience, unity, and the enduring strength of a community that refused to be silenced. And as the stars began to appear, one by one, Thomas knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, stronger, braver, and more united than ever before. A legacy forged in unity. The changes in the neighborhood were subtle at first, like the first rays of sunlight breaking through a stormy sky. The streets felt lighter, freer, as if the air itself had shed the weight of Derek Wallace's oppressive presence. Children played without glancing nervously over their shoulders. Neighbors lingered longer on their porches, their conversations no longer tinged with unease. But while the shadows of the past began to recede, Thomas Johnson knew that true change required constant vigilance. The newly formed Civilian Oversight Board was up and running, its members a diverse group that represented the best of the community: teachers, small business owners, retirees, and even a high school student. Their task was monumental: to review complaints, ensure transparency, and rebuild the fragile bridge of trust between the police and the people they served. A different kind of watchful eye. Elena Martinez, the young officer who had bridged the gap between the force and the community, was a frequent visitor to the Oversight Board meetings. She listened intently as people shared their experiences, taking notes and asking questions. Her presence, once met with skepticism, had become a symbol of possibility, a reminder that the badge didn't have to be a shield for abuse, but could also be a symbol of service. One evening, after a particularly emotional meeting, Alina approached Thomas outside the community center. The night was quiet, the faint hum of distant traffic the only sound. "Mr. Johnson," she began, her voice soft but firm, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, that actions speak louder than words. I want to do more than just attend these meetings. I want to be part of the solution." Thomas nodded, his expression thoughtful. "What do you have in mind?" "I want to start a program," Elena said, her eyes bright with determination. "Something that brings the police and the community together. Mentorship, outreach, anything that shows we're on the same side." Thomas's face softened, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "That's a good idea," he said. But it'll take work. Trust isn't rebuilt overnight. Elena nodded. I'm ready for that. Building bridges. The program, called Bridges of Hope, began as a series of small events. Officers visiting schools to read to children, community barbecues where residents and police shared meals and stories, and neighborhood cleanups that brought everyone together. Elena spearheaded the effort, but she wasn't alone. Marcus, Carla, Linda, and even George threw themselves into the project, their combined efforts creating something greater than any of them had imagined. At one of the first events, a mentorship day for at-risk youth, Thomas was asked to speak. He stood before a group of wide-eyed teenagers, their futures uncertain but their potential boundless. I'm not here to lecture you, he began, his voice steady but warm. I'm here to tell you that you matter. Your voice, your actions, your dreams, they matter. And no matter where you come from or what you've been through, you have the power to change your world. The teenagers listened intently, their eyes fixed on the man who spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had lived through more than they could imagine. Afterward, a young girl approached him, her voice barely above a whisper. Do you really think I can change things? She asked, her hands fidgeting nervously. Thomas crouched slightly to meet her gaze, his expression kind but serious. I don't just think it. I know it, he said. But change starts small. It starts with believing in yourself, even when it's hard. The ripple effect. As Bridges of Hope gained momentum, its impact rippled outward. Other neighborhoods began to take notice, reaching out to Elena and her team for advice on starting similar programs. The city council, initially skeptical of the oversight board's ability to create meaningful change, began to view it as a model for other communities. But progress wasn't without its challenges. Some officers resisted the changes, viewing the board as an unnecessary intrusion. Others, like Derek Wallace's closest allies, spread whispers of doubt, claiming the board was more about politics than progress. One evening, after a long day of organizing, Marcus approached Thomas with a troubled expression. Mr. G, he said, his voice heavy, do you think this will really stick? Or are we just putting a Band-Aid on something bigger? Thomas leaned back in his chair, his eyes thoughtful. Change is messy, he said. It's slow and frustrating, and sometimes it feels like you're not getting anywhere. But every step we take, every bridge we build, makes the foundation stronger. It's not about fixing everything all at once. It's about laying the groundwork for the next generation to do better. Marcus nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. I just don't want us to lose what we've built. We won't, Thomas said firmly, because we've built it together. And together, we're unstoppable. A confrontation revisited. Despite the progress, the specter of Derek Wallace lingered. While he had been stripped of his badge and his power, his presence in the neighborhood remained a source of unease. He spent his days walking the streets, his glare a silent challenge to those who had stood against him. One afternoon, as Thomas strolled through the park, he found himself face to face with Derek. The encounter was unplanned, the tension immediate. Well, if it isn't the great Thomas Johnson, Derek sneered, his voice dripping with bitterness. Enjoying your victory. Thomas stopped, his expression calm but firm. This was never about victory, Derek, he said. It was about justice, about doing what's right. Derek scoffed, stepping closer. You think you've changed anything? The system's too big, too powerful. You might have knocked me down, but you'll never take it all down. Thomas met Derek's gaze without flinching. You're right, he said quietly. The system is big, but it's not unbreakable. Change doesn't happen all at once. It happens piece by piece, person by person. And whether you like it or not, it's happening. For a moment, Derek seemed to falter, his confidence cracking under the weight of Thomas's words. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his shoulders hunched against the invisible weight he now carried. A legacy renewed. Months turned into a year, and the neighborhood continued to flourish. The oversight board became a permanent fixture, its success inspiring similar initiatives across the city. Bridges of Hope grew into a citywide program, fostering connections and rebuilding trust in ways no one had thought possible. Thomas, though still a guiding presence, began to step back, trusting the next generation to carry the torch. He spent more time on his porch, watching the neighborhood he had fought so hard to protect come alive with hope and possibility. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Marcus and Carla joined him. They sat in comfortable silence for a while before Marcus spoke. "Mr. G," he said, his voice soft, "do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't stood up that night?" Thomas smiled faintly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but it's not about what could have been. It's about what is. And what is something worth fighting for." As the first stars appeared in the sky, Thomas felt a profound sense of peace. The fight for justice, for respect, for dignity, it was never truly over. But he had faith in the community he had helped shape, in the strength of the people who had found their voices. Together, they had created something that would endure, a legacy of resilience, unity, and hope. And that, Thomas thought, was more than enough.